Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. One of the things that the Salafis like to say against the Ash'ari and Maturidi madhabs in Aqeedah is that we interpret when we're not allowed to interpret. So before we get into the screenshot that I want to show, I'm going to clarify the principle of the Ash'aris and Maturidis and all of Ahlus Sunnah, and then we'll get into the screenshot and what they kind of say. The principle within the Ash'ari and Maturidi madhab is that everything from the Qur'an and Sunnah is taken on its literal and apparent meaning except what has an evidence to point otherwise. And the evidence can either be from the Qur'an, from the Sunnah, or the intellect. And the intellect meaning if the intellect says that such wording is impossible at the level of impossibility of saying 1 + 1 = 10, right? Just as how that is absolutely impossible. If the apparent wording of the Qur'an or the Sunnah states something impossible like that, then we're allowed to interpret. This is the Ash'ari and Maturidi principle. The Salafi principle is that everything is taken on its literal, apparent meaning, except what has an evidence from the Qur'an and Sunnah, and they reject the evidences of the intellect, or so they say. And so in this screenshot here is where I want to show that they contradict their own principles and actually take from the Ash'ari principles. What do I mean by that? Over here, Imam Ibn Uthaymeen, he's the leader of the Salafi sect. He's talking about the verse where Allah says, أَأَمِنْتُم مَّن فِي السَّمَاءِ, that man fi sama, who is in the sky. So he says, وَالَّذِي فِي السَّمَاءِ هُوَ اللَّهُ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ, the one who's in the sky, in the heavens, is Allah. But then he says, وَلَكِنْ هَا هُنَا إِشْكَالٍ, there's a problem here. That there's a problem with saying that Allah is in the sky. What's this problem that he found? It's that he couldn't figure out how could the wording of the Quran say that Allah is in the sky, but Allah can't be in the sky. How could that be? He says, "Ha huna ishkal." There's a problem here. He says, "Wahuwa anna fi lidharfiyya," that the word in is like it's an adverb, and he says what that means is فَإِذَا كَانَ اللَّهُ فِي السَّمَاءِ, that if Allah is in the sky, it means the sky surrounds Allah. And he gives the example of a cup. He says if you pour water in the cup and you say the water is in the cup, it means the cup surrounds the water. So he says if you say Allah is in the sky, it means the sky surrounds Allah. So he's saying there's a problem here. We can't say that the sky surrounds Allah. This is something that is, impossible. Again, intellectually impossible. So he says over here, فَهَذَا, he comments on the verse. He says, أَأَمِنْتُم مَّن فِي السَّمَاءِ فَهَذَا ظَاهِرُهُ أَنَّ السَّمَاءَ مُحِيطَةٌ بِاللَّهِ, that the literal apparent of this verse where it says man fis sama, the one who is in the sky, the literal and apparent meaning of this verse is that the sky surrounds and encompasses Allah. He says وَهَذَا ظَاهِر بَاطِل, and this apparent / literal meaning is batil, it's nonsense. This is what he's saying about the literal of the Quran, which is something that they don't ever reject. But here, contradict the principle, go straight to the Ash'ari principles, because this is exactly what the Ash'ari say, and it's not what the Salafis agree with. However, when there's a problem that you can't solve, you have to go against your own principles, because if your principles, they don't add up, you won't be able to use them for every single thing. Anyhow, getting back to what he says here, he says, وَإِذَا كَانَ الظَّاهِرُ بَاطِلًا فَإِنَّنَا نَعْلَمُ عِلْمَ الْيَقِينِ أَنَّهُ غَيْرُ مُرَادٍ لِلَّهِ, that this is exactly what the Ash'ari say, that if the literal and apparent, and this is what I just said right before this, right, when I was explaining the principle, if the literal apparent wording of the Quran and Sunnah is batil, is impossible or untrue, if that's the case, then we know for sure that this is not what Allah intended. This is exactly what the Ash'ari say, that if there is something that is impossible, something that it just can't be that this is what the meaning is, then we know ilm al-yaqeen, we know for certain that this is not the meaning that Allah intended. And this is what he's saying here. Complete, copy-paste from the Ash'ari madhab. So he says, فَمَا الْجَوَابُ عَلَى هَذَا الْإِشْكَالِ, that what's the answer to this problem that we have? There's two answers, okay? Two answers. Number one, إِمَّا أَن نَجْعَلَ السَّمَاءَ بِمَعْنَى الْعُلُوِ, we take the meaning of sky and we change the meaning of it, and we make it mean above, okay? We make the meaning of sky to mean above. So we say that Allah is in aboveness, right? And he says that that's acceptable. Do you know what this is called? This is called interpretation, and this is called ta'wil. For those of you who hear that word all the time and you don't know, what it exactly refers to, this is exactly what ta'wil is, because ta'wil is sarful lafz an zahirihi, right? To you have the zahir meaning, where he just said that the zahir means that the sky surrounds Allah. You have the zahir meaning, and he says sarful lafz. In other words, you turn away from the zahir meaning and you give a different meaning of that word. Such as if I was to say that you are a lion. I'm not referring to you being the animal and the actual zahir, the literal of that, the literal of a lion. I'm not saying that you are literally a lion. I'm saying that you are brave, right? Because the lion is known for bravery. If I was to say you are the moon, I'm referring to you are beautiful. So I don't mean that you're the actual moon, right? So in the same way, he's saying that we change the meaning of the literal to mean something else. And that's exactly what metaphorical usage is, and that's what ta'wil and interpretation is. So he says, the first answer is that we can change the meaning of as-sama. So it says, أَأَمِنْتُم مَنْ فِي السَّمَاءِ يعني أَأَمِنْتُم مَنْ فِي الْعُلُوِ. That the one who is in the sky, in other words, the one who is in aboveness, right? So he says we can do that. Or he says, oh, naj'al, this is number 2. He says, oh, naj'alu, naj'alu fi bima'na ala, right? Or we can make the meaning of fi turn into ala. What does that mean? We change the meaning of in to mean on top of, above, right? So it means amintum man fis sama, يعني amintum man ala sama, in the sky, meaning above the sky. And he says, and if we change the meanings here, then there's no problem, because yes, Allah is above the skies. And again, they believe that Allah is some type of physical being above the skies. But he says, this is how we solve that problem. So how do you do it? So what happened here? What happened here is there was a problem. There was an intellectual problem in the apparent wording of the Qur'an. The apparent wording of the Qur'an is then ruled out as batil. And when the apparent wording is ruled out as batil, he went to interpretation. This is exactly what the Ash'aris do, and this is what they attack the Ash'aris for all the time. But then when when there's a problem and they can't solve the problem, you got to use the Ash'ari principles, because the Ash'ari principles, they're built off of qawa'id that are muttarid. They're solid. It's useful and helpful in every situation, and they're actually solid principles that can be followed to find the correct understanding of the Qur'an and the Sunnah in Aqeedah. Anyhow, this is all I wanted to share for this video. Inshallah. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.